But again, let me introduce myself. My name is Paul Schmidt. I'm the Executive Director for the Road to Recovery, and we welcome you to the monthly webinar series that spotlights and highlights the work of species working groups. We've been doing this for a year plus now and have found it very informative, both for the presenters, but also hopefully for the attendees. And as a note at the beginning, we're looking for volunteers to present on future webinars, as I said, spotlighting the work that you're doing in your species working group. So if you're willing and able and interested, please get in contact with us, either me and put your message in the chat, or Quinn Carvey, who's our graduate fellow, who is actually the one who will be running the webinar itself. Let me highlight a couple of things that we have on the in the near future relative to Road to Recovery. We have a continuation of the private lands engagement session in a series focusing on conservation of birds through private lands work. And we had a great session earlier in the summer. And the next session will be focused on the international arena, if you will, for private lands and how other countries are dealing with this issue of conserving birds through private lands partnerships. That will be on Wednesday, next Wednesday, October the 16th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. If you're interested in that, I'd encourage you to register for that on our website and attend it next week. We'll have future ones as well in the next couple of months relative to private lands. And one in the not too distant future will be focused on state agencies and state actions that can be taken. So look for those as well. And a shout out to Quinn Carvey and her team, who did an engagement session last month on the future conservation leaders, or future leaders in conservation engagement session, and that was the first in a series as well. So keep an eye out for future of those sessions. I think you'll find them very interesting, particularly if you are early in your career and interested in bird conservation. Okay, with that little bit of introduction, I'll pass it to Quinn Carvey, who will introduce the topic today and our speakers. Thanks, Quinn.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, who will be giving a talk about grassland birds. Our first presenter is Brant Ryder. Brant Ryder is the Chief Conservation Scientist for Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. He comes to us today from Fort Collins, Colorado, and acknowledges that the land he is on today is the ancestral homeland of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute tribes. Brant has a BS in wildlife biology from Unity College and a PhD from the University of Missouri. Prior to coming to Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, Brant spent a decade as a research scientist at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, working on diverse topics from population dynamics of migratory birds to the behavioral processes underlying avian social networks. At BCR, Brant focuses extensively on grassland bird population recovery and conservation planning. Brant has been a key part of Road to Recovery over the last 4 years, serving on both the core team, leadership team, and species working group subcommittees. Our second presenter is Chris Latimer. Chris Latimer is the Research Director for Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. He also comes to us today from Fort Collins, Colorado, and acknowledges that the land he is on today is the ancestral land of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute tribes. Chris has a BS in biology from Virginia Tech and a PhD from University of Wisconsin-Madison. Prior to joining BCR, Chris worked extensively on impacts of agricultural practices on global bird diversity with the Nature Conservancy. At BCR, Chris's work aims to apply cutting-edge quantitative models to solve complex conservation challenges, support the recovery of grassland birds, and maximize the effectiveness of conservation delivery. So thank you, Brant and Chris, and I'll turn it over to you for your presentation.
Thanks so much, Quinn, and Paul, and Katie, and Esmeralda, for all the work that you guys have done. Let's see if we can get the screen shared. Thank you all for coming. I hope you guys all got more sleep than I got last night. I was out chasing the Northern Lights until probably way later than I should have been. All right, can you all see my screen?
Looks good.
Okay, thank you so much. So I really appreciate the invite. As Quinn mentioned, I've been part of Road to Recovery, and I'm excited to be able to, come to you today and talk about the work that we've been doing in grasslands. So I'll just jump right into the presentation, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions right at the end. Okay, so I always think it's important to have level setting information. I know I see a lot of familiar faces on the call, a lot of grassland folks. But I think it's important, for those of you who aren't familiar with grasslands, to provide that baseline. So grasslands provide a range of ecosystem services. We know they support human livelihoods and well-being, and they also sustain really important biodiversity. We know these ecosystems represent roughly 40% of the terrestrial landmass, and it's very clear that they're under significant threat. This biome is facing threats from agricultural conversion, tree and shrub encroachment, changes in management practices, so on and so forth. And those threats are undermining the ability of this ecosystem to actually support both human livelihoods and biodiversity. I think a lot of people would argue, and I would be among those that to say that this is a biome that is in collapse. And so I think you'll hear about some of the unique challenges that grasslands face over the next couple of slides. So I told you that grasslands are a biome in collapse. Everyone has seen the data. Birds are a really good harbinger of environmental change. And we know that grassland birds are one of the most steeply declining groups of land birds. Some populations of grassland birds have lost 70 to 90% of their historic population size. And these patterns are consistent, not just across birds, but across other taxa in these ecosystems. So this is truly a biome that we need to pay significant attention to. And so while, graphs can show a very clear story, nothing quite solidifies the message of percent population loss over the long term, as well as the Road to Recovery tipping point list. And because this is a Road to Recovery webinar, I just wanted to throw up very briefly some of those percent declines that we've seen for some of those grassland birds. And as you can see, the numbers are pretty striking. I think they speak for themselves for those taxa that we have data on. Many of these populations have lost 3/4 of their historic population sizes. And so we know that there's a lot of species in grassland that are of significant conservation need. And then there's a whole host of species that didn't show up on the tipping point list, but also are in steep decline. But I didn't come here today to give the doom and gloom talk. I think we've heard enough of that. In fact, my hope with the presentation is to provide a bit of an uplifting message, to talk to you about how our conservation mindset has evolved and how we've learned from our past mistakes. And my involvement in Road to Recovery has been a huge part of that. So as the data has been amassing about the loss of native grasslands and the species that inhabit them, there were a couple of initiatives that helped spearhead the start of the grassland bird working group. The first is the Central Grassland Roadmap Initiative. I know I saw many familiar names who are involved in that initiative. It is a multinational collaborative that is aimed at protecting and restoring grasslands and engaging diverse voices to create partnerships, address funding and policy gaps, and then also lift up conservation efforts. And then the second effort, again, a lot of you are familiar with because you're here at this webinar, is Road to Recovery. And Road to Recovery is a really, really important initiative that aims to marry biological and social science information to inform recovery and management of steeply declining species. And obviously the common thread between those two initiatives is the engagement and inclusivity of diverse perspectives and objectives in our conservation thinking and planning, moving beyond the simple biological mindset to incorporate some of these key human dimensions elements. And so because, again, this is a Road to Recovery webinar, I thought it might be important for those of you who haven't for the full history of Road to Recovery to highlight how our thinking has evolved within Road to Recovery. When we started out as a group, a handful of us thinking about, how do we address recovering steeply declining species, we had a pretty strictly biological mindset. And this pyramid reflects our initial thinking on the way we were approaching recovering steeply declining species. But as we engaged diverse voices and we started thinking more holistically about some of the complex conservation problems, we realized that we really needed to embrace the human dimensions elements of conservation challenges. And that more holistic viewpoint is what is shown in the multi-phased approach that now we put forward as part of the Road to Recovery process. And I would argue that this isn't only happening in the roadmap and in Road to Recovery, but I do think we're seeing a paradigm shift in our thinking about how we approach and solve these complex conservation challenges. And I think if we look back, strategic conservation planning historically, as I mentioned, focus on mitigating biological causes of population decline. And what the recognition is now is that we need to also tackle these human dimensions elements of these conservation problems. And that when we fail to account for those things, that may be one of the reasons why our conservation efforts fail. So if we look ourselves in the mirror and we ask ourselves, why has bird conservation maybe not been as successful as we had hoped it might have been over the last 25 plus years? It may very well be because we have not fully accounted for the human dimensions elements of some of these challenges. I think when we can recognize and be inclusive and incorporate these diverse stakeholder perspectives early on and from the outset, I think we can maximize the likelihood of our conservation being successful. We can also avoid implementation gap, make sure our science is more actionable. And then the final element of incorporating those human dimensions elements is the ability to begin to understand how social science can help us understand how and where behavioral change campaigns might be needed for us to be successful in a conservation space. Let's see. So as I hinted at early on, we know that grasslands face some very unique challenges. This is a predominantly privately owned landscape, all the way from Canada throughout the Great Plains of the US and down into Mexico, and that includes traditionally indigenously held lands. And so that's one of the first challenges we have to embrace. And as a working group, we wanted to think about those diverse voices and those diverse sectors and objectives that might be within those different sectors and data within those different sectors and how we might be able to bring those things together. So we know this is a predominantly privately owned landscape. The first bucket that we wanted to think about was the social science or human dimensions element of this conservation challenge. We know that one of our primary tools in grasslands and addressing conservation in grasslands requires engaging private landowners and leveraging voluntary incentive-based conservation. That is using farm bill dollars, typically here in the US, and cost share programs to put conservation delivery on the ground. As I mentioned, we know that there are a number of indigenous nations within this landscape, and they have unique and important cultural heritage, and that heritage dictates their willingness and ability to engage in current conservation strategies. Second, we have a host of socioeconomic factors that are at play. Because this is a largely working landscape, we need to ensure that whatever conservation we're putting forward is going to assure economic viability for range and cattle operations on the landscape. And then the third big bucket here is the ecological component. So we have some significant risks on the landscape: risk of agricultural conversion, risk of tree and shrub encroachment, climate change, threats around climate change. And then obviously we have the patterns of steeply declining bird populations. So we're trying to encapsulate and address all of those things in our conservation construct and solution. Bit of a slide delay here. So before we get too far into the inner workings of the working group, I wanted to address one last significant challenge that the conservation community, I think, is facing. And we've seen this highlighted in a handful of the grassland bird slides But I think we've seen this also in some of our discussions around Road to Recovery. So as a community, we are always looking for efficiencies, ways to scale our conservation. And we've gone back and forth about what the best approach looks like. Do we take a very single species specific approach, or do we take a community approach? And we've had a lot of conversations about this at Road to Recovery. And one of the things I want to highlight is that I think we need a both and strategy. Both have their merits and their value. And as a working group, we do both of those things. And I think you'll see this throughout. So we do some single species work, but then we also try to roll things up into a community level or ecosystem approach. And so as a working group, we're trying to thread that needle. And I think a lot of the conversations that you've probably heard in these working group webinars have a very similar theme to them. You've seen it also probably in some of the Road to Recovery workshops if you've attended any of those. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a bit about our working group. We've already talked a little bit about the roadmap and Road to Recovery. Our working group tried to embrace some of those concepts. So we have a multinational working group. It's a coalition of partners from Mexico, the US, Canada, and First Nations. And we also wanted to include diverse disciplines in our working group. So our working group includes a whole host of different partners, from range ecologists to bird biologists to social scientists to economists, to communications experts, to geneticists. So we're really trying to take this holistic picture and have these diverse areas, multidisciplinary expertises. So the mandate of our working group is to develop specific data products and tools that we hope can help stabilize and recover grassland birds over the next 20 years, as set as a goal by the Central Grassland Bird Working Group, so that stable or recovering target. And we aim to do that through the development of these multidisciplinary spatial prioritizations. And Chris Latimer will be talking at length about the approach that we're taking to do those prioritizations and how we hope those prioritizations can address these multi-diverse stakeholder objectives. So who is the working group? Well, the working group is all of us. It's anyone who has interest in grasslands and in grassland birds. And we have a sign-up list, and we can send that out. We have a core group of partners, and those groups of partners are shown on this slide. So you can see, as I mentioned, multinational and diverse in nature. So I wanted to just take a quick second to talk about some of the function of how our working group functions, and then we'll really dive into the meat of the work that we're doing as a working group. Our working group, as you'll see on this next slide, we've been lucky enough to raise quite a bit of money for our working group, and we've done that through a number of kind of core partners. Kind of synergistic funding was provided by NCEAS, which is the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. They fund multidisciplinary working groups. We've also received significant funding from NIFWIF and some from Knobloch Family Foundation. So just real quick, talk about some working group functions, and then a little bit about how our working group exists within the broader conservation delivery pipeline. So we're unique in one respect that we exist within this broader landscape and under this broader umbrella of the Grassland Roadmap Initiative. Excuse me. And there are a number of other working groups that we work in parallel with. And we can answer some questions about that, how we're working with those other working groups. So we fall into a bit of a constellation governance, where our working group exists within this constellation of other working groups. We're also trying to work importantly in a collaborative space with other key partners, and other key stakeholders that will hopefully be using some of the tools that we're developing. So that includes joint ventures, it includes Fish and Wildlife Service, it includes Natural Resource Conservation Service, Forest Service, so on and so forth. And then, of course, private lands delivery. And we aim for all of our work to be done through a co-production lens, which happens through our Science Technical Committee, where we engage and have real-time conversations with that technical committee about the products that are being developed and what is going into those products. We are also doing some focus group work. And so as we develop specific data products and decision support tools to be used by end users, we will have focus group engagement process where end users can give us real-time feedback before the product is developed, and then once we have a prototype product, so that we can make sure that that product has the highest utility for those end users. Let's see, what else do I want to say? We've had a number of face-to-face meetings. I know from beneficial management practices, we've been lucky enough to have a facilitator to help with our working group, and that's really been crucial in terms of some of our success, having that external partner and external voice there to help guide some of our difficult conversations. And then we also have, of course, monthly Zoom meetings and then lots of kind of side conversations about the work. And we have lots of different pieces of that work that are being picked up and supported by different key partners. So last slide that I'm going to give, and then I'll turn it over to Chris. Our working group grew out of this larger initiative. And one of the key questions that repeatedly arose around grasslands is, where should we be working, and what action should we be putting on the ground? And Chris is going to revisit this point explicitly here in a couple minutes. But we were lucky in that we had a really decent foundation, a robust data set on count data for grassland birds. We understand the biology of grassland birds fairly well, and we have a fairly strong handle on what the threats are that are facing these species. So we use those as building blocks to try to develop these spatially explicit data products and decision support tools, which Chris is going to spend a lot of time talking about. Ultimately, the goal is obviously to maximize population growth, and to do that in such a way that we can both support a grass-based economy and also grassland birds at the same time. So Chris, I think I'm just going to turn it over to you with that and let you go. And if you just want to tell me when you want me to switch slides, I will go ahead and do it.
Great, thanks, Brant. You can go ahead and hit the next so that that animation goes. I think it's kind of messed up. There you go. Yeah, so as Brant mentioned, the Grassland Bird Working Group has been a bit of an evolution, and I think it's important to step back and show our work a little bit, show where we've been so that you get a little bit of context of where we're at and where we're headed. And so this is kind of a schematic diagram of sort of the first draft, really trying to get at setting population and habitat targets for grassland bird conservation. And so the first draft of this, developing species density models where we can estimate population sizes and the relationship between grassland amount, and relying on that relationship there on the left to project under future grassland loss scenarios how we might expect populations to and then in the middle there, taking other data sources like the breeding bird survey, estimating current population trends. So in this hypothetical example, we see a negative trend of 4% per year. And then we know that by 2043, we wanted a trend of 0 that represents a stable population. And so the question that we're trying to answer here is what do we need to limit population declines to in order to meet that stable 10-year population trend objective of 0. And so in this example, that would be negative 0.8%. Can go on to the next slide, Brent. And so just to solidify what this looks like, shown here for a couple of species examples. So really what we're trying to do here is translate those population targets set by the trend, the 10-year stable trend into habitat targets. And so for this example, showing again the population response to increasing levels of grassland loss, if we, for chestnut collared longspur, have a population target of minus 0.8% per year to get to that stable trend of 0, we would need to limit the annual grassland loss to somewhere around 0.68%-ish. And same with Sprague's pipit and the other species. But going through this process highlighted several unique challenges. One, we heard a lot of feedback from partners that it would be great to have this able to be scalable across space and through time. So for instance, with this approach here, we were only able to get population and habitat loss thresholds at geographically explicit areas, or for areas of interest, rather than being fully spatially explicit that we can combine for any geographic area of interest. Likewise, none of the work in this initial draft incorporated the non-breeding season information. And so, next slide, Brant. Really, we've spent a tremendous amount of time to date figuring out how to develop a bird model that would allow us to get to where we want to be able to understand what it takes to get to the population stability and recovery goals of the roadmap. And so, having the Grassland Bird Working Group and being supported through NCs and the other partners that Brant highlighted, really allowed us to take a step back and design with the end in mind. And so what we're showing here is a full annual cycle integrated count-based abundance model that allows us to predict population responses, not only based on historic data, but project those responses in the future. This model is spatially explicit. It estimates both population density and population growth rates, and it allows us to predict future ecological responses in the future, which I'll touch on a little bit in a moment. Next slide, Brant. And so once we have these maps, sort of a business as usual or typical approach that we might see is folks tend to take those maps and implement some sort of prioritization algorithm to basically look at where the best places are for bird conservation. And there's been a number of arguments in the literature recently that suggests, moving beyond that approach and really trying to get clear about what we're prioritizing for. And so in an ideal world, we would have effectiveness, information on the effectiveness of our conservation practices across the Great Plains biome that we could then use to prioritize. Unfortunately, we don't have the data available for that type of approach at scale. And so the approach that we're taking for this challenge is through scenarios. So the two key threats that Brant highlighted earlier are grassland loss due to agricultural conversion and woody plant encroachment. And so those are the two sort of threats that we're going to focus on for this broad scale biome level mapping, with the understanding that this needs to be an iterative process, and as new, better information becomes available, particularly for distinct geographies, this approach will need to be stepped down to be more effective in our conservation. Next slide, Brent. And so, and so as Brant mentioned, another component of this work is not just focusing on the bird element, which is an important component, but in many ways, given the nature of the landscape and how much of the landscape is privately owned, it's very apparent that we need to incorporate additional constraints, particularly from the socioeconomic side of things. And so our working group has spent a lot of time thinking about how to incorporate some of these other components, particularly around the economics and sociocultural values and capacity to get voluntary conservation on the ground, as well as what do we do about climate change. Next slide, Brant. And so this is just to give you a couple of examples of the types of maps and data that are being produced from these full annual cycle models. First showing for Baird sparrow, again, estimating the abundance, population growth rate in the middle. Bluer areas indicate more positive population growth, and red negative. And then it was aptly pointed out to us that the most stable population is an extinct one. And so really developing spatial prioritizations around population growth rate might not be the best idea. And so if there's a way that we can combine abundance and population growth rate together, we may come up with a better process for prioritizing across the landscape. And so that map on the right shows the relative contribution of a given location to the overall population growth rate. And so it combines those abundance and population growth rates together. Next. And just showing again for Sprague's pipit. And so again, these maps look somewhat similar, but very much the same if you take a hard look. And so this also gets at the challenge that Brant highlighted earlier in the single species versus multiple species approaches, and you know, our working group being very aware of that and trying to incorporate both of those, that both and strategy that Brant was talking about. Next. Okay, so to give an example of what the scenarios might look like for prioritizing those conservation actions. First, the map on the right is showing a risk layer of agricultural conversion. So the purple pixels are areas that have already been converted, that were historically grasslands that have been already converted to agricultural lands. And then the yellow pixels are those pixels that are most vulnerable to agricultural conversion. And so we're anticipating 3 scenarios, one based on current land use trajectories. So estimating roughly 4%, continued 4% loss into the future, and estimating how we can expect populations to respond to those losses. Another scenario we're considering is a no net loss. And so every pixel that is lost is then replaced through restoration. And then a potential restoration scenario. So not only no loss, but we're able to get more restoration through, for example, CRP, and protecting those grasslands through, for example, easements and improved grazing management practices. And that might suggest a restoration type of scenario. And we're hoping to use and work very closely with the JV8 to estimate what these scenarios might look like and put the guardrails on how these scenarios are actually defined. Next slide, Brant. And then taking a similar approach for woody plant encroachment. Again, those three broad scenarios that I highlighted, but also working with our partners to actually define what the numbers should look like, particularly around that restoration scenario. Next slide. And so figuring out what to do and how to incorporate socio-ecological information into the prioritizations has been a bit of a struggle. And one approach that we've looked at very closely for replicating or mimicking is this example published by Sage et al. In 2022, showing social perceptibility of increasing habitat connectivity for grizzly bears in Montana. And so through a survey instrument, a social science survey instrument, they were able to map spatially spatial variation in social receptivity to this conservation action. And this type of information could then be fed into a prioritization or constraints on a prioritization to make sure that we're focusing our efforts not just in the best places for grassland birds, but in the places that are, sort of optimize that trade-off between, social acceptability and perceptibility and grassland bird conservation. So, but as you can imagine, the amount of effort that went into this at a very small geographic area around Montana, scaling that up across the biome with very diverse and unique communities across such a large landscape is very, very challenging. Next slide. And so, again, for this initial pass, we're looking at a couple of data sources that could be used to inform social acceptance or proxies for social acceptance or receptivity or capacity to get conservation on the ground. And the first is the Headwaters Economics Rural Capacity Map, which has 12 indicators of capacity, particularly focused on rural communities. And then NRCS's RCA data viewer that tallies the number of conservation practices that are put on the landscape at both a watershed and a county level. And so while these are very coarse proxies, we think that there is some value to be gleaned from these data sources as we're continuing working towards stepping this down for more local landscapes using more refined types of data, such as that Sage et al. Example. Next slide. All right. I think that there's another, is there something else here on the slide, Brent? Right, okay. So this is just to give you an example of what a spatial prioritization looks like. The caveat here is that this was just done for the breeding season for one species, Baird sparrow, and not considering any other socioeconomic information, just what the landscape prioritization would look like if we just focused on birds. And the idea here is that, we can, once we incorporate some of those other diverse objectives, the idea is to sort of balance those objectives between our conservation and our social objectives together. And the nice thing about the spatial prioritization here, each pixel gets a ranking according to its inclusion in a final prioritization step. And so those more yellow and orange pixels are selected as sort of the quote best places for grassland bird conservation. And the nice thing about this is we can scale it to whatever scale we want. So for example, you can look at how populations are doing within only those prioritized landscapes relative to the entire geography, or different geographic subsets of interest in a very scalable way. And the idea is that hopefully partners can use this information to be more targeted and tailor their conservation actions towards the places that have the highest impacts for grassland birds, but also most likely to succeed given that community will and buy-in. Next slide, Brent. And so then again, seeing this as an iterative process, as new and better information becomes available, updating these maps and tools to incorporate that additional information. So incorporating climate projections and climate adaptations within the prioritization framework. You know, we know that economics is important. Again, that the data on economics is very sparse in this region, and so getting better information on economics is going to be critical. And yeah, next slide.
So it's question slide.
Oh,
So
okay.
We're
Yeah.
pretty much wrapped up. I can stop sharing, and if I can figure out where my mouse is, it's hiding. All right, I think we're back.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Brant and Chris, for an excellent talk on this Grassland Birds Working Group and the work you've done so far. We are now opening up the floor to questions. You can raise your hand or you can post your questions in the chat. And I had a question while we're waiting for people to warm up.
Sure thing.
So you formed a really multidisciplinary working group, and I was just wondering if you could speak to maybe the kinds of conversations or topics that you've had come up in this because of the different people and groups that you're working with, and maybe there's even an example that comes to mind.
Yeah, I mean, I can start. Well, I mean, one thing I will say is that it's not an easy task to, especially because so many issues in bird conservation have so many different players. Trying to determine what subset is appropriate to identify who those partners are can be really challenging. And obviously, as anybody knows, the more voices you get in the room, the more challenging it is to either find a consensus-based decision or to move the conversation forward. In fact, things can go around and around. I mean, obviously, the two most challenging parts of the grassland bird working group that we have faced is with the human dimensions, trying to find, we want to do a biome scale prioritization, right? But finding appropriate data sets has been a real challenge. And, you know, it's been super helpful to have a couple of social scientists at the table and say, you can't do that, you can't replicate that SAGE study across this entire biome. Like, that will take you 10 years to do. So you're going to have to find other sorts of data sets that can serve as appropriate proxies for you to be able to address that component of this very complicated challenge. So that was one. And then the economics data set and the economist as part of our working group has highlighted that, you know, using data sets around the cost of land doesn't necessarily translate into the cost of the management practice, right? Which is ultimately what you care about. So those are two examples of, you know, dialogues that we had and how those diverse perspectives have helped us tackle the multidisciplinary nature of the problem. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, Chris.
No, I think you hit it on the head.
Great, we've got some questions in the chat. Up first, what do you think are the most important drivers to social acceptance of grassland conservation?
Yeah, I mean, we have a little bit of a unique perspective because we also have a private lands program where we work directly with landowners. And I think there are two concerns in this landscape. And drought is one of the predominant ones, and then economic solvency is the other. So if we go forward and present a solution to private landowners across the Great Plains that is going to undercut their economic bottom line, even if it's beneficial for grassland birds, it's probably not going to be a successful solution. So we're really trying to balance. We're trying to balance the programs that are available, those voluntary conservation programs, farm bill programs, and make sure we're incentivizing the ones that have the greatest wildlife benefit. And this is, the really important part of the slide that Chris gave, is that when we understand the effectiveness of those practices and we know which practices work well, then we can go to landowners and say, look, this is a win-win situation. As an example of that, we can go out there and show landowners the data on the economic cost of tree and shrub encroachment on their property. Here's the forage production loss that you're having. And by having a tree and shrub encroached landscape, not only is it not beneficial for you and your cattle production, but it's not beneficial for the grassland birds that need this landscape. So we look for those win-win types of solutions.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think that there's an enormous capacity gap as well across the landscape, and some landowners have access to programs, and if they're able to get into an NRCS office and have access to those programs, sometimes they get technical assistance. Sometimes there's not enough capacity to go around, and so that's another thing that we're hoping that RCA data viewer information will provide us with.
Thank you. What data sources did you use to inform your stable trend charts?
Yeah, so was that, I'm assuming that's referencing the that sort of hypothetical example where, yeah, so there's several slides that I can think of. Breeding bird survey data was for sort of that initial draft that I talked about. What are the current trends? What do we need to get to stable? But all of this stuff from then to now is integrating eBird, breeding bird survey, and integrated monitoring and bird conservation regions data sets together to model and map the change in population size, abundance, growth rate, and relative contribution.
Okay, and we have a request in the chat asking if you have the methods for this process posted or published anywhere. They're interested in learning more about the modeling process.
So we do have a paper that shows the integrated model and how that works and the math and statistics behind it. We can share that around with the group. And then we did submit through the roadmap a sort of a 2-page document outlining sort of the approach, but nothing beyond that, nothing peer-reviewed publication as in terms of the approach. Like I said, we're still at the place where we're just now getting these maps for the 17 priority species. And so in line with the 80-20% principle, we have about 80% of the work left in 20% of the time.
Thank you. And yeah, if you send us some of that information, we'd be happy to share it widely with the participants. You talked about how you're working under an umbrella framework with other groups and initiatives. How does the Central Grassland Working Group coordinate with a parallel range-wide effort like the JV8, which also maybe creates its own science-based prioritization tools? Is there acknowledged separation, or is there duplicated overlap, et cetera?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's something that we've spent a lot of time talking about and being very proactive about. So the good news is that because the Central Grassland Roadmap existed, and we had a lot of buy-in from a diverse suite of partners, including the JV8 partners. They were already engaged in the process, and there was a lot of alignment in the goals and targets of the roadmap and the goals and targets that are outlined in the JV8 business plan. But we have been explicitly sitting down and talking to the JV8 coordinators, and there is a specific JV8 Science Technical Committee, which has been providing real-time feedback to us on the types of covariates that we put into the models, reviewing the modeling outputs, having, real-time conversations and putting data products in front of them. And then, as I mentioned, we are doing these user focal groups, and the JVs in particular, they have decision makers across multiple different scales, and we view them in many ways to be one of the key conservation delivery arms of the roadmap. And we know that the JV8 will be stepping down a lot of these data products into their own geographies. And so the user focal groups is another touch point with individuals across that JV8 conservation delivery pipeline. So we've been engaging with them in multiple different ways, from the high level to all the way down to the field level. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Chris.
Yeah, I think we have had a lot of conversations about this. Some partners really want that final step of a spatial prioritization. Others just want the data products that underlie that spatial prioritization. And so we aim to be as flexible as possible in providing the maximum amount of information available, so that folks can run and do their own analyses with it.
Yeah, Paul.
Thanks, Quinn. And I think between Tom's question and then Rebecca's comment, you may have already touched upon it, Brant and Chris, but I'm really keen on what you think or how important it is to have this integration between the work that you're doing and the joint ventures, and spreading, because you mentioned it early on in the presentation about the dichotomy, Brant, single species, multi-species, ecosystem, et cetera. And for the others who maybe haven't have full engagement with joint ventures, give me some thoughts about those topics.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's essential, Paul. And, as I mentioned, the JV8 has been out on this landscape for a very long time. They know who a lot of the key local partners are. And so I think part of the way I view it is we aim to do this biome level exercise and prioritization, and provide flexibility in what the data products are that are available. So we want everybody to be able to see themselves in the solution. Some JVs may have, a greater threat around woody plant encroachment. And so they may be very interested in a prioritization product that combines the bird data and the woody plant data. Whereas another JV may be very interested in the ag conversion problem, because that's their primary threat and the primary thing that they're, focused on addressing. And so that was part of the reason we didn't just cram everything together and say, here's your one solution, your one prioritization, because that can be alienating to some of those key partners out there on the landscape. And our goal is not, as a working group, to do the delivery side of this. We want to provide tools to help the decision making and maximize conservation success. And so that's we spent a lot of time as a working group talking about how do we pull apart the different pieces of this to make sure that we can address not just the JV8's perspectives, but Fish and Wildlife Service's perspectives, and things they might be interested in working on the landscape. They have a partners for Fish and Wildlife program as well, where they've got partner biologists working on the landscape. So trying to make sure we're taking all those different perspectives and providing tools that can be put together or pulled apart in ways that are very, very valuable and meaningful.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Paul, so we've been working very closely with the JVs, as Brant mentioned, and I think a great example, I saw Rebecca Rhinelander in the chat. So I'll call her out, and Ann Bartasavage and Amanda Haberlin. They're developing this Got Birds tool that I think, as I highlighted earlier, we aim to be flexible in producing data products that others may find useful and integrating into their own current existing workflows. And Got Birds, I think is a great example of taking that extra step that I was highlighting earlier about prioritizing conservation actions, and they have a tool that really at a local level tries to estimate the effectiveness of tree and shrub removal on grassland bird species. And so if you haven't seen their presentations, I would encourage you to reach out to them and check those out, because I think it's a great example of how our two groups have been collaborating together to make sure that the products that we're producing are complementary to the work that they're already doing.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, some Indigenous communities may view trees with deep reverence, such as considering them as sacred beings, ancestors, or spirit guides. I'm curious what you've learned through interacting with Indigenous community members and talking about tree encroachment as a major threat in grasslands. Are we aligned across Great Plains communities on recognizing tree encroachment as a threat?
I think it's probably too early for us to answer that question. I think the perspectives, one thing we have learned collectively in engaging Indigenous partners is that one First Nations doesn't necessarily have the same perspective as another, and they don't want to be lumped together. And they want their individual voices heard. And so one of the things we didn't talk a lot about today that we are aiming to do, we're in the process currently of hiring a social scientist. And that social scientist, working with Katie Holland, will be doing some specific engagement with Indigenous communities. One of the things that the roadmap did early on was try to collect some social science data out there on the landscape. And Indigenous communities weren't as well represented in that sample as we would have liked. And so we're going to try to go out there and actually get some more of that local, focal survey data in a subset of Indigenous communities to try to better understand their objectives, some of the challenges that they might face, try to incorporate some of their Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge into our thinking about how we think about this conservation construct and problem. So that is work that is still kind of ongoing. So I think it's a little premature for me to say how different Indigenous communities might view the tree issue. But I agree that it's likely to vary from one Indigenous community to the next.
Great. Thanks, Brant and Chris. Any last minute questions? We'll keep the chat open in case you do. But I want to chime in here and thank Quinn for organizing a great presentation, continued webinar. Brant and Chris, fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And a thank you to Pamela, our interpreter, who tried to keep up with the speed of Brant and others like me, who probably talk way too fast. So we apologize if we did that. And we will have the slide. I think that Quinn can make sure that you can get some of those resources. Steve, who's asking for it in the chat. And we will be posting this recording on our website, both the Spanish and English versions of that. If you like this, I recommend you join one of the future private lands engagement sessions. You heard how important private lands is into our conservation efforts, and I think you'll benefit from some of those future presentations, or engagement sessions, which are more interactive by nature. And one of them will be next week on Wednesday. A thank you to the Knobloch Family Foundation and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, who have supported the Road to Recovery movement, and I think well benefiting the full community of species working groups. If you would like to present in the future, highlight the work of your species working group or the work you're doing relative to bird conservation, we are anxious to hear from you. And please let us know at our email address is very simple, r2rbirds@gmail.com. And you can get that from our website, r2rbirds.org. We had great attendance today, and I think it's a reflection of the issue and the presenters. So thank you again very much, Brant and Chris and Quinn. Anything final, Quinn, to close us out?
I think that's it. Yeah, thank you for everyone for coming.
Very good. Thanks all. See you next month, if not sooner.